Please note this meeting will be webcast and the press and the public will see and hear the meeting through the webcast, and if they so wish. And in the unlikely event that there's a technical issue with the webcast, the meeting will be paused to see if the issue can be resolved. Agenda papers have been published in accordance with the usual practice. Please note some housekeeping points. Please turn off your mobile phones or keep them on silent during the meeting. Please raise your hand at the appropriate time if you wish to speak. I will make a note of the hands and take them in order that I see them. Please remember to turn your microphones on when you wish to speak and off once you're finished. In the unlikely event of the fire alarm, please use the nearest fire exit and assemble near the fireplaces, which are situated to the left of the main entrance when you exit the building. I'd like to introduce you to the officers tonight. On my left, Lindsay Vallis. Lindsay?
Yeah, I'm Lindsay Vallis, Transition Head of Licensing, Cemeteries and Crematory Services.
Good evening, councillors. Simon Gallagher, Principal Licensing Officer, Aylesbury Vale area.
Good evening, I'm Caroline Stephen, the Licensing Team Leader for the Wickham area.
Good evening, I'm Charlie Robinson, Licensing Manager for the Chiltern and South Bucks areas.
Good evening, I'm Claire Gray from Democratic Services and I'm clerking the meeting this evening.
Good evening, my name is Matthew Dale Harris. I'm a barrister at Landmark Chambers and I'm here to offer any advice you need on licensing and local government law.
Thank you. Okay, so item 1, apologies for absence. Do we have any apologies, Claire?
Thank you, Chairman. With apologies from Dominic Barnes, Gurinder Wadwa, Tony Green and Jonathan Rush.
Thank you. Item 2 is declaration of interests. Does any member wish to declare any interest tonight? Thank you. Okay, we're looking at the minutes of the previous meetings. That's page 3 to 12. Are members happy to agree the minutes from the 30th of June?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going into part A, which is the statutory functions, new statement of licensing policy, Licensing Act 2003, pages 13 to page 156. Okay, so Simon Gallagher is to present the report and then we'll answer any questions from councillors. Simon.
Thank you, Chair. So the Licensing Committee are being asked to agree to 2 recommendations this evening. Firstly, to agree the content of the draft new licensing policy statement for Buckinghamshire Council as required under the Licensing Act 2003, and a copy of the draft policy is shown at Appendix 1 of the report. Second recommendation, to agree the commencement of a public consultation on the new Buckinghamshire Council licensing policy. It's assumed that members will have read the report, but I do take the opportunity to briefly run through the salient points. So in accordance with the Licensing Act 2003, the Council has a legal duty to prepare and publish a statement of licensing policy every 5 years. As all members will be aware, the promotion of the 4 licensing objectives are fundamental to any decision concerning licensing matters. The primary purpose of the policy is to set out how the Council intends to promote the 4 licensing objectives when exercising its licensing functions. It is expected that licensing subcommittee, applicants, responsible authorities and residents will make reference to the policy when considering licensing matters. Currently, the licensing service of the Council is operating under 4 separate policies reflecting the 4 former district council licensing authorities. In accordance with the transition regulations that govern the formation of the new Buckinghamshire Council, the Council has 2 years to adopt, publish and implement one single policy. The deadline for implementation is by the 1st of April 2022, and the law requires that the decision to adopt the final version of the policy is reserved to full Council. The Licensing Act and accompanying statutory guidance set out certain matters that should be included in the Licensing Authority's Statement of Licensing policy. These matters have all been taken into account when drafting this policy. Beyond this, the licensing authorities are free to include such matters as they consider relevant or appropriate. The policy is therefore an opportunity to promote and encourage adherence to other council policies, priorities and strategies. A number of such areas have been identified, many of which not only promote the licensing objectives, but also Buckinghamshire Council's key priorities. A pre-consultation exercise was carried out in May and June of this year with key stakeholders. The survey questions focused on draft policy areas that were considered of most interest to the stakeholders. Survey questions are shown at Appendix 2 of the report, and the report of the findings are shown at Appendix 3. The results of the survey have helped shape the content of the new draft policy. We received 107 individual responses to the pre-consultation exercise, and these were broadly reflective of the various interest groups, so 30% from residents, 23% from businesses, and 35% from councillors. Encouragingly, there was significant support expressed for all the policy areas consulted on, ranging from 73 through to over 90% support, save for the removal of the Buckingham Hours policy. I'll just briefly focus on two key areas. Firstly, 82% of respondents supported a removal of the historic cumulative impact policy for Aylesbury, whilst keeping it under review. This policy creates a rebuttable presumption that high-risk premises will be refused licences after 00:30, and all premises refused licences after 2:30 in the morning. The policy is based on historical evidence of high levels of crime and disorder and nuisance arising as a consequence of the concentration of late licensed premises in this area. As a result of legislation changes that took effect in 2018, cumulative impact policies must now be supported by way of a formal cumulative impact assessment, which must be kept under review every 3 years. The Aylesbury Town Centre cumulative impact policy was last reviewed in 2015, and the statutory guidance sets out the kinds of robust evidence needed to demonstrate cumulative impact, as referenced in paragraph 2.21 of the report. It's proposed at this time that there is insufficient evidence to support cumulative impact policy for Aylesbury Town Centre. Thames Valley Police have submitted a separate evaluation report advocating maintaining the policy. However, it is respectively argued that the report does not readily offer sufficient grounds to maintain the policy for the reasons given in paragraph 2.17 of the report. On balance, it is therefore proposed that the cumulative impact policy for Aylesbury Town Centre is not maintained in the new policy. However, it is proposed that in light of the police concerns that the area be kept under formal review for the period of 12 months from the introduction of the policy, with the findings of the assessment reported back to the Licensing Committee for further consideration. Thames Valley Police have also submitted a number of other control measures in respect of licensed premises in Aylesbury Town Centre they would like to see. Many of these areas are reflected in the new policy where appropriate, and a detailed response to the measures is shown at Appendix 5. Also, just to clarify, the report from Thames Valley Police in respect of Aylesbury Town Centre was the only report we received from Thames Valley Police, and there were no reports in respect of other areas within Buckinghamshire. Respondents identified 5 other areas that they considered susceptible to the effects of cumulative impact, namely High Wycombe, Marlow, Beaconsfield, Buckingham and Amersham on the Hill. No supporting evidence has been provided, but the licensing service will monitor these areas for signs of emerging cumulative impact effects. Secondly, with respect to the Buckingham policy, opinion was evenly split. 46% support removal of the hours policy, whilst 47% of respondents supported its retention. The policy has evolved based on historic lice decisions and provides applicants with an expectation of the likely result of submitting an application for a late licence in this area. This approach is different to a cumulative impact policy as it's not based on the cumulative effect of licensed premises. The policy is based on supporting information last reviewed in 2015. It is respectfully argued that the supporting evidence is no longer available to justify the policy, as detailed in paragraph 2.27 of the report. That said, concerned parties will still be able to make representation, and the licensing service will continue to be alive to any emerging evidence that warrants a change of policy in this regard. 3 other areas were mentioned as areas of potential concern in relation to trading hours: High Wycombe, Marlow and Amersham on the Hill. Similarly, the licensing service will monitor for emerging evidence to support any potential change of policy in this area. With the committee's consent, it is proposed that a public consultation exercise run for a period of 6 weeks over August and September. Ward councillors will be notified in advance of the consultation. Key stakeholders will be consulted directly, and the consultation will be advertised through the council's usual media channels. Findings from the consultation will be reported back to members in October, at which point the licensing committee will be asked to approve a final version of the policy full consideration, for consideration by full council for adoption in November this year. That's the report, Chair. So open to any questions or comments, please.
Has any members got any questions they'd like to ask?
That one there. Sorry, so there will no longer be a presumption to refuse late night licence applications. Just checking, the comments by main theme at the bottom said obviously the one of the reasons for looking to remove this requirement was, to remove the cumulative impact policy was to support businesses re-establishing themselves, and in particular the nighttime economy. If a premises, I'm open to be entirely corrected, if a premises has already got a licence for a late nighttime, to serve, surely there is instinctively there's a preference to renew that in any case in the future, unless there's been significant breaches at that premises which would merit it being withdrawn. So in terms of removing this policy which makes it harder for more licensed premises to open up, with a view to supporting existing businesses who are bouncing back from COVID, aren't you simply introducing more competition into the marketplace, which would potentially make it harder for established businesses to bounce back if there are more premises licenses doing exactly the same function that they are doing historically? So I just question whether or not that is actually sensible. And my second point was I totally see that ostensibly there is very strong support for removing this policy. However, I would probably, I'd just like to know, in terms of the councillors and also the police who are on the forefront of dealing with the ramifications of this policy, what weighting is applied to their comments? Are they allowed to have effectively one comment each, and that's registered as one submission? Because obviously, if I was a canny licensed premises who wanted to get numerous more, extend my number of premises or whatever, I could get numbers of my employees who live within Aylesbury to comment on this en masse to make it seem as if proportionately there was huge public upswell for throwing open the floodgates, as it were, to to licensed premises a lot throughout Aylesbury. So just wondering what the weighting was, because I don't really want to. The police already have a tough enough time as it is. I don't really want to give them even more problems in the future.
Thank you, Councillor. Just addressing the second question first. There was no weighting as such to the responses, but what I can say is there was 82% support, and that was across the board. So that was members, residents, and businesses. Of course, part of the reason for the recommendation in terms of carrying out a review was based on the views of the police, and that's why, because obviously their weight under the guidance, the statutory guidance, licensing authority should give significant weight to the views of the police on crime and disorder matters. So I would suggest that it's not a decision or a recommendation that's made lightly in terms of not continuing with the policy, and but it's unfortunate that the evidence isn't there currently, and that's why the proposal because it's come from the Thames Valley Police, that the proposal is that we carry out a full review rather than just essentially park the policy for now.
Sorry, so to be clear, because we're being asked here to remove this policy, aren't we? The cumulative impact policy is going to be removed for a year and kept under monitor. That's what we're being asked to sort of agree, isn't it?
Essentially, that's the outcome of it. Yeah. So this is a new policy that essentially the council was adopting from scratch. The question is whether we continue with a historic legacy policy for the Aylesbury town centre area.
Oh, I see. So sorry, you mean it's a new policy in terms of Bucks Council, but it's not actually a new policy because this is a historic policy which we're looking to get rid of from the Aylesbury Vale predecessor council.
Essentially, that's the crux of it. Yes.
Okay.
So the decision today is to go out to consultation on the policy. So that's then you would make your decision on the final draft of that policy in October.
Sure. And just to be final point, the police, though, in the initial consultation which preceded this document being put together, was their view that this shouldn't be removed, or was it that they would go along with a trial run, effectively, if it did get removed, and then see if it could be reimposed later? Or did they give any specific comments as to their sort of preference?
Their comments are set out in, I think it's Appendix 4. That's the only information that we've had in terms of Ali Police's view. So,
yeah, I mean, I think just to add to that, so we have had quite extensive conversations with the police since they submitted that piece of evidence, because obviously they, you know, as Simon said, we do give great weight to them because of they're the lead agency for crime and disorder, aren't they? So it's really important that we take into account their views when we're considering any policy change in relation to this type of policy. Unfortunately, the evidence that they provided to us, which spans a reasonable period of time, I think goes back to 2018. So even discounting the fact that we've had a closed period within the nighttime economy for COVID, there is a decrease in violent crime. So there doesn't appear to be that link between the premises and the nighttime economy. And in fact, the statement that was submitted by the neighbourhood policing sergeant, is that the title? I might not have got his title right, indicated that actually the problem for them occurs at kick-out time when all the premises shut at the same time, and then they have a policing problem. So you can imagine that if you actually didn't have that restrictive policy in place, perhaps you might have premises that opened later, which would allow a staggered departure from the premises. So there's it's quite a complex issue. I think there's a variety of different things coming into play, and I think it's really important that we continue to work with the police. And I think Simon spent a lot of time talking to them about their submission, and then we've given this commitment to make sure that within 12 months there's a full assessment carried out. So we would work with them over the next 12 months to look at the data, collect the evidence, and decide whether or not we've got sufficient there actually to consider reintroducing it for Aylesbury, but not just Aylesbury, because this is an area legacy policy, and actually as a new council we've got to think about all of our sort of very busy nighttime economy locations and decide whether or not to adopt a consistent approach where we've got similar issues. And so I think it's that level playing field at the start. We haven't got enough evidence to meet the statutory guidance in our view at the moment to put it, to retain it. But in a year's time, having collected more information, reviewed it and worked with the police, it might be that we reintroduce it for Aylesbury, but also we look to introduce it in other locations where we've got similar issues.
In terms of the evidence base, was the consultation affected by, obviously, COVID? I mean, it was actually a question which is probably going to bleed into some of the other items on tonight's agenda, but has the COVID epidemic impacted the normal routes, I imagine it has, of consulting with the public on their views on this? Because I can imagine a lot of it's been done digitally, whereas historically it would have been done, you know, in hard copy paper, libraries, all the rest of that, circulating things. Would you say that it's diminished the evidence base that supports withdrawing the cumulative impact policy?
No, I don't think I would say that. I mean, we use the same consultation channels that we've used for a number of years, and that is principally via electronic means, so emails, through the council's usual media channels, through residents' newsletters, those sorts of things. So I don't think that would have a detrimental impact on the response rates that we get.
Thank you. Councillor Baum.
You'll be pleased to know my question was actually asked just then by Councillor Southworth about consultation. So, thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else got any questions? Councillor Town and then Councillor Watson.
Listen to the exchange just now. It popped into my head that is the loss of this policy, the cumulative impact policy, is it making it such that you've got a one-size-fits-all for different towns? It may be appropriate for someone like a quieter town, whereas a more heavily populated town could have problems. So I know you're going to have a consultation period, and you'll do a trial for a year, but is that long enough to actually assess how it's going to fit into each town?
So the cumulative effect, cumulative policy was just Aylesbury left over from the Aylesbury Vale District Council, whereas the other towns in Buckinghamshire don't have that policy. So because obviously we're now one council, we want to have one policy that covers the whole of the county. But I'll leave it to Lindsay or to Simon to actually
Yeah, so
give the detail.
the proposal is to remove the existing cumulative impact policy for Aylesbury. So that, that was there historically because at the time that it was introduced, there was an evidence base to support us limiting late night licensed premises in Aylesbury. And what's argued now is that at the moment that's not there. So what we're doing, I think, is kind of what you were talking about. So what we're trying to do over the next year is actually look at some of those areas where respondents to our survey said that they felt that we had got some issues, and that cumulative impact might be relevant and might be a useful tool. So where that's been raised, what we'll be doing is just looking at the evidence associated with those areas and then saying, does that meet the statutory threshold? Do we think that's a good idea? Do we need to introduce cumulative impact policies or do we not? Do we, and all of that would come back to you. So if we, if in a year's time we have collected sufficient evidence to say that we think there should be more cumulative impact policies in Buckinghamshire, or even a reinstatement of the Aylesbury one, we would come back to the committee and we would present that evidence to you, and we would, seek your views. And I don't know, there's probably another consultation period, is there, on cumulative impact? If we put it back in?
Yes.
Yeah, further public consultation. Yeah.
Okay.
So does that make sense? Is that what you were?
I think so. It's just that, say, 1 year from now, we're still coming out of COVID, so it's not really I'm not sure how you would baseline the trial of, say, 12 months. But we are where we are, so it's worth just doing. And then we're going to review it in a year's time anyway. So
I agree with you.
nothing
I think 12 months actually might not be enough time for us to actually pull together relevant information for the Aylesbury area. Just not from the services side, because I think we can easily do that, but it's actually whether or not it's a representative period in terms of COVID recovery and all of that sort of thing. I think, what we wanted to do was give the police a commitment that we would ensure that we kept that area under review. And the 12-month cut-off is not a date set in stone, it's just a recommendation that we bring it back to talk to you about it at that point. And that might just be an update paper or a briefing paper, and then you might say, send us away and do a little bit more. So.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Town. Councillor Watson?
Thank you. I'm just reminded to look at the principles in 1.2 about preventing public nuisance, protecting children from harm, public safety, preventing crime and disorder. I don't come from Aylesbury, but I suspect that our predecessors on the Aylesbury Licensing Committee did and made decisions which were appropriate for Aylesbury, so I wouldn't want to second guess them. And to my mind, I think I would prefer that to use the vernacular, we levelled up rather than levelled down here, and I would not. I think the survey sample is too small. The number of residents. I mean, who would want to have a young family living near one of these establishments if it's all the way through the night? I just wonder how many of these people are actually having a say, and so my instinct would be to have the Aylesbury policy across the whole county rather than weaken the Aylesbury policy. But that's just how it's an instinctive reaction
And has
rather
there been
than
any evidence to that?
factual or evidence-based, just common sense.
I'll pass it over to Simon, who's just asked, is there any evidence to say that we should bring it and roll it out through the whole county? Or not?
No, I mean, as I mentioned in the opening address, there were a number of areas that were identified by respondents as potential areas for consideration. But the key thing here is that what we need to bear in mind is, particularly in light of the change of legislation in 2018 that put cumulative impact policies and these supporting assessments on more of a statutory footing, And the guidance and legislation is quite clear that we need to be able to support decisions to implement these cumulative impact policies, and that they need to be routinely, the evidence base needs to be routinely scrutinised. And what we're saying is that at this present time, there just doesn't appear to be that evidence looking on the factors that we're obliged to take into account.
I'm not sure you've got evidence to take it away either. I just think it's a bit thin, the case here. So I know you've studied it much more than I have, but that's my first reaction. It's not overwhelming, and we could inadvertently make a lot of people's lives a misery if we're not careful. So we need to really think this one through.
I was just going to add, the other thing I would always have in the back of our minds around these types of premises is that, you know, just because you remove a cumulative impact policy doesn't mean that you haven't got control. So the police and environmental health, they're responsible authorities for the Licensing Act. They're able to call a review of a licence at any time. So if you have an individual premises that's causing problems in relation to any of those 4 licensing objectives and there's evidence of an issue, the police, in fact, we can do it as well as a licensing authority. We can also call a review. So we can pull that licence and that licence holder in for review. We can review the terms of their licence, the conditions on their licence, and whether or not they should continue to hold that licence in actual fact. So there remains the ability to do that where you have a premises that is causing a problem. The other thing is that obviously every single new application that comes in for a premises licence goes out to public consultation and is advertised via our public register. It's will be notified to all ward councillors, as well as the local communities, parish councils. And that's the opportunity for residents who might live in close proximity to a premises to raise concerns about what's been put in that licence application. So they might say that the hours are too late, or that they shouldn't be able to play music in the back garden, or those sorts of things. And that's at that point, if that's a contested application, then that comes to a subcommittee of licensing members, and you're able then to make a decision about whether or not to grant that licence, or whether or not to impose conditions on that licence if you grant it. So there remains elements of control around these issues, whether or not you have a cumulative impact policy in place. So there's the opportunity to target premises that cause a problem without penalising others.
Yeah, and please be assured we've done that in the past. I think Councillor Southworth.
I fully appreciate this is just a report, and we're not being asked to actually vote for anything or to make any changes, and this will just be going to a consultation. I do understand that. I was just quickly wondering, if this does end up being removed, this is just to put a marker down, so when this does end up coming back to us after the consultation, and we then do, I presume, get an opportunity to potentially revise or chop up things that we think actually, may potentially even be contrary to the officer's recommendations, might not be appropriate. We will have that opportunity, because it just seems to me that, again, and coming from the sunlit uplands of Chesham, where never a fist is ever raised in anger, there must have been a very specific reason why the predecessors chose to put this policy in place. And it feels to me like sometimes it's a lot easier to get rid of something than it is to put it back in place. And someone probably put a lot of work into putting this into effect. It would seem a little bit rash of us to just strip it out. So I simply just wanted to check that we can have the liberty of amending it subsequently when it comes back.
Yep, so the decision is ultimately for the committee to make on whether to approve the final version of the policy that comes to you in October. What we will do as part of the consultation process is we will collate the feedback that we have, we'll analyse it and present it to you within that report. We will come forward with suggested approach, but ultimately it's your decision, yeah.
Has anybody else got any more questions? No? Okay, so what we'll do then is we will ask for a proposer or a seconder for the recommendation. It's number 1 is to agree the content of the draft new licensing policy statement for Buckinghamshire Council as required under the Licensing Act 2003. And number 2, to agree the commencement of the public consultation on the new Buckinghamshire Council licensing policy. Do I have a proposer? Councillor Andrew Wood, and a seconder, Councillor Joseph Baum. So now we'll do a vote of hands. Firstly, I would like to take those for the motion. Yep,
Sorry, 5 in favour, Chairman.
thank you. Against? And abstentions? 1. 2. Okay. Thank you. So that concludes that part. We'll now go on to part B, which is other licensing functions. And we're going to be looking at the pavement licensing. So item 5. We will have a report regarding the pavement licensing, the Business and Planning Act 2020, Pavement Licensing Coronavirus Amendment Regulation 2021. Pages 157 to 162. So we're going to pass over to Charlie Robinson as the licensing manager to present this report, and then we'll have a discussion afterwards. Charlie.
Thank you, Chairman. Good evening all. I trust you've all had time to read the report pack for this agenda item relating to the pavement licensing. To give a bit of background, back in July 2020, the Business and Planning Act 2020 received royal assent. This act brought in a number of powers and duties for local authorities, covering a wide range of matters, all with a view to support local businesses and assist economic recovery as COVID restrictions began to ease. One of the changes introduced by the Act relates to the approach in dealing with outdoor furniture provision for relevant businesses to enable them to increase their trading space. The Act essentially introduces a condensed and simplified process for any business serving hot food or drink, just food or drink, to apply for a licence to have tables, chairs and other furniture placed on the highway adjacent to their premises. As part of this change, the responsibility for the regime moved from highway services to the licensing team. The powers are temporary and were originally in place until 30th September 2021. However, they are now new regulations which amend this Act, extending the powers until 30th of September 2022. Throughout the papers, you'll see that these regulations are referred to as being in draft form and awaiting approval. However, I can confirm that they have now come into force as of the 20th of July 2021. At the meeting of the Licensing Committee on the 9th of September 2020, members were made aware of the changes introduced by the Act and resolved that a fee of £100 would be charged for each pavement licence once issued, and all licences would be valid for the maximum length of time, which was until the 30th of September this year, in line with the government guidance. This means that all 38 licences that the Council has issued to date under this regime are due to expire at the end of September this year. As such, if these premises wish to maintain their outside areas that are currently covered by a licence, they will need to reapply. And in order to promote a consistent approach, it's recommended that the committee agrees that we continue to issue pavement licences for the maximum permitted length. This would mean that although the premises would have to reapply for their licences, their newly issued licences would be valid until September 2022. Similarly, all new premises which wish to apply for a licence and achieve that would have a licence issued until that same date. Committee are also asked to consider the fee associated with these licences. Under the Act, the pavement licences are a non-executive function and are therefore delegated to the Licensing Committee to set the fees. The Act also sets a maximum fee threshold of £100. In 2020, at the Licensing Committee, the fee was proposed for the pavement licences to be that maximum threshold of £100. The cost of the council administering these pavement licences and the new scheme is actually higher than this, which is understood to be in the region of about £300 per licence. It's therefore recommended that the committee confirms to retain the same fee of £100 for each pavement licence, in line with the restrictions specified by government, and this will go part way towards the cost of the provision of providing the service. As a final addition, it may assist the committee to know that the government are now looking at how these temporary powers can be formalised into a permanent arrangement, which we don't have too much information on at the moment, but it will be out for consultation and asking for responses, with the hope that this may be in place before the new end date of these temporary powers, and officers will continue to follow the developments and update the committee as is needed. I'll open up for any questions now. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Has anyone got any questions? Councillor Watson.
Yes, it's a question of understanding, really. I suppose questions are about understanding, aren't they? But anyway, it's to do with street furniture and tables and chairs and patio burners, I understand. But what about, say, pillars and roofing and things like that, which seems to be catching on in a few places, shall I put it that way, which wasn't there before. Is that covered by this or not? Some sort of clarification. And is there any sort of enforcement going on or a checking to actually see what's actually happening at street level?
Of course, yep. So in terms of permanent structures, like lean-to type structures, they'd be subject to planning requirements. So they would be dealt with through that route before they reach the licensing side. In terms of enforcement, there's obviously, we've got the licensing officers who are accepting any complaints from residents, and we also carry out routine inspections across the county. And there's also conditions that are in place on these licenses to make sure that there is accessibility in terms of enough space on pavements for wheelchair users to pass, and that there's no obstructions causing that sort of thing, and general safety terms on there as well. Does that clarify that point for you, Councillor?
Are officers actually getting out to look? That's my question.
Yeah, so just to add to that, with the first piece of legislation, the first temporary piece of legislation that was brought in, it was at that point linked, because as you can see, Business and Planning Act, linked to a temporary, what would you call it, like a temporary lift on the planning restrictions on structures, actually, outside. So in order to assist business, something that would previously have required planning consent was allowed to have a temporary structure without the need for consent via planning through this process. And I would imagine, I'm just going to look at Charlie, that has been extended through to September 22. You're going to check. I would imagine it's been extended. Ultimately, when they consult on whether or not to make this legislation permanent, I think that is the kind of thing that we will absolutely as a council need to feed into, because I know it's not necessarily our regime to manage and control those structures, but from a planning perspective, we want to make sure we've got high quality development happening in those kind of locations, and not necessarily, lean to structures that aren't, what you'd want to see in those locations in the long term. So when that consultation comes out, I think that is something we'll absolutely be feeding in on. In terms of officers getting out to look at them, I would say to you, we go when we've got intelligence that indicates we need to. So yes, we do go to them, but only when we know that there's a problem. Yeah. Yeah, no, predominantly reactive. I mean, it is a permissive regime. It's there to support business. It was introduced by government to facilitate outdoor trading. So if we're made aware of a problem, we absolutely will follow it up. And we do. We've had a few, but not many, to be honest, but mostly it's very compliant, but we have had a couple.
Councillor
clearly
Southworth,
making-
I was just waiting to see if Charlie had found the answer. If not, we'll go on to...
Mine's very, sorry, it's a question there may not be even an answer to. I was just wondering if, obviously we're making a loss of £200 every single time we issue one of these. Has the government given any indication that you're aware of whether we might be able to, post-September 2022, revise the fees up so that, or at least so we're not subsidising it to such a, it's a public benefit to have this. I totally get that. So as a council taxpayer, I'm not unhappy to pay that, but it does seem like there might need to be a bit of a revision above £100 to make it a bit more equitable, perhaps.
So we'll definitely be feeding that back as part of the consultation that the government will be holding with the local authorities. And as you say, it's a permissive temporary arrangement, so that's why there was that fee put in place, that it wasn't a burden on premises, that it was all part of, obviously, recovery. But that definitely will be part of the consultation responses, and I'm sure across the country. In terms of the planning regulations, so apologies, I didn't pick up on it previously because it's not mentioned in these new regulations. Essentially, the planning permission exemptions are attached to the issuing of the licence. So with the licence being extended until September 2022, the planning naturally does extend with it.
Okay, thank you. And obviously, if there's anything in your ward that you don't think complies, then you just let the team know. Councillor Wood.
Yeah, thank you. Can I just ask where the £7,600, which is the 38 licences, have been granted, which budget's that coming from as a loss?
Licensing.
Sorry?
Licensing.
So we just write that off?
Mm-hmm. Well, I have to offset it against other income, but to be honest, you have to be extremely cautious about that because as a council, there's certain elements of our licensing regime that can only be self-funding. So you'll talk about that a little bit later in your fees and charges paper. So, for example, taxi licensing income can only be used to fund taxi licensing services. So, you know, we talked a little bit about the Licensing Act regime earlier with Simon's proposal on the draft policy. Now that is an area where the fees have not been reviewed since the legislation was introduced in 2003. And so we are currently operating to a nationally prescribed fee regime that does not cover the cost of delivering that service. So that part of our service can operate at a loss year on year because of that fee regime. So where we're in a position to influence fees, such as in relation to pavement licensing, I think it's really important that we do push that forward to government and say to them, you know, we should be able to charge fees that cover reasonable costs incurred by the council in delivering these services.
Does anyone get any more questions? Okay, right. So again, we'll need a proposer and a seconder for the recommendations, which are, there's three of them. To note the changes to the Business and Planning Act 2020 introduced by the Business and Planning Act 2020 Pavement Licensing Coronavirus Amendment Regulations 2021. Number 2, to confirm the proposed duration of pavement licences subject to the Business and Planning Act 2020 Pavement Licensing Coronavirus Amendment Regulations 2021 coming into effect. To confirm the level of the fee charged in respect of the applications for pavement licensing issued under the Business and Planning Act 2020. So I'll need a proposer and a seconder. Councillor Derek Town to propose and a seconder. Councillor Nick Southworth to be seconder. Thank you. So we'll go to the vote now. So those in favour?
Seven in favour, Chairman.
Okay, I'll just for sake of it, anyone against or any abstentions? 0. Thank you. Okay, thank you. That concludes Part B, Section 5. So we'll move on to number 6 in Part B, which is the taxi and private hire licensing fees and charges, which are page 163 to 198. Okay. So following agreement with the Cabinet Member for Regulatory Services, which is Nick Naylor, and myself as Chairman of the committee, I would like to update the committee on a minor amendment to the taxi licensing policy, which will come into force on the 6th of September 2021. The agreed amendment enables existing licensed vehicles that are not already subject to the age requirements set down within the policy to continue to be licensed until the vehicle is 15 years old or until the 1st of September 2024, whichever is the sooner. This will include wheelchair accessible vehicles that were previously licensed by WDC, Wickham District Council, as the Hackney carriage vehicles. This gives the majority of the licensed trades who are not already subject to the 10-year vehicle age limit additional time to prepare and plan the change of their vehicles, and is aimed specifically to maintaining the level of supply of wheelchair accessible vehicles, known as WAVs, available for passengers across the council area. It should also mean that there is a greater choice of affordable electric wheelchair accessible vehicles available in the market at the time of replacement, which supports the council's environmental objectives. We're also considering extending the maximum age limit of larger, more specialist wheelchair accessible vehicles, and will feed back to the committee in due course. This amendment has been made following feedback from the licensed trade on the possible impacts of this part of the policy. We are committed to working with the licensed trade to implement the new policy from the 6th of September 2021. So now we're going to turn to the report of the fees and charges, and I'll ask Caroline Stephen to present her report. Thank you, Caroline.
Thank you, Chair. Hopefully you've all had an opportunity to read the report, and you'll know that it relates to the fees that we need to charge the taxi and private hire trades to provide the licensing service. The committee is being asked tonight to approve the fees as proposed and set out at Appendix 1 to support the implementation of the Council's new taxi policy and to ensure consistency across the legacy areas for all of the trade. The relevant legislation sets out what can and cannot be included within the licensing fees, and one of the central issues to take into consideration is that they are required by law to be cost neutral, and any surplus or deficit must be carried forward and taken into consideration when setting future fees. As Lindsay mentioned earlier, we can't use any income from the taxi fees anywhere else on any other service, so it has to stay within the taxi service and it has to be accounted very carefully. We're obviously a new authority with a new service structure which is in the process of being implemented, and it would be frankly impossible at this stage to predict with 100% certainty what the costs are likely to be over the next 12 to 36 months. Fortunately, we're not required to do this. Fee setting is a rolling process, and we can only start with carefully calculated assumptions as to the likely cost of the service. The methodology behind producing the fees and charges was considered and agreed by this committee at 2 previous meetings on the 23rd of March and the 14th of April this year. At the meeting on the 14th of April, the committee also approved that the then proposed fees could be sent out for a full consultation, and that consultation has now been carried out. The results and the responses are set out within the report at Appendices C and D. At the time of the previous meeting, benchmarking was carried out with the surrounding authorities, which indicated that the proposed fees for vehicles and operators were generally lower than the surrounding authorities, and that the driver fees came out at about mid-range. And this was despite the majority of those authorities, they hadn't yet having revised their fees in light of the new statutory standards, which I'll discuss later. Those figures have recently been reviewed, and the current benchmarking data is shown within Appendix A of the report. And it indicates that 4 out of the 5 authorities who appear to be charging a lower driver fee than the proposed new fee for Buckinghamshire Council have not still yet reviewed their fees in light of the statutory standards. Also, since the last committee meeting, further work has been carried out in terms of the digital improvements to the service, and as a result, we are now in a position to further reduce all of the proposed fees. The new proposed fees, as I mentioned, are set out in the report alongside the previous fees charged by the legacy areas. These are obviously lower than the fees that were provided for the consultation exercise, and so may go some way to alleviate the concerns raised by the trade and specifically by the drivers. Just to touch briefly on the financial positions within the legacy authorities, because obviously we all used to charge or still do currently charge separate fees for the service. There's an overall budget deficit in the region of about £90,000, but the decision was made not to include this when setting the current fees because we didn't think it would be fair to the trade, particularly in light of the pandemic, the loss of income in the last year caused by that, and the increased cost to the service because of the statutory standards. The deficit also obviously predates the formation of the new council. I'm just going to touch briefly on the statutory standards because they have had quite a big impact on the fees. They were introduced by the Department for Transport in July last year, obviously in the middle of the pandemic, and their intention is to improve public safety, protect young and vulnerable users of licensed vehicles, and prevent abuse and exploitation, which unfortunately has historically been associated with the trades in some areas of the country. A full report on the standards was presented to this committee on the 3rd of February this year, but in brief, there will unfortunately be inevitable additional costs resulting from their implementation, including the need to conduct 6 monthly criminal records checks on all licensed drivers, bearing in mind we've got in the region of 3,500 licensed drivers in this area, and we currently only check those every 3 years on renewal. The service will also need to carry out a review of all existing licence holders in light of the new standards to ensure that the licence holders can comply with the new requirements. This will include the cost of ensuring that all current licensed drivers have an acceptable level of spoken English, which is something that we discussed at the last meeting of this committee. Vehicle licence holders and private hire operators will also now be required to provide basic DBS certificates, police checks basically, and these will need to be authenticated and considered in light of the Council's criminal records policy. We'll also need to carry out additional checks on operators' record keeping and the staff working in private hire operating centres. Now, clearly all of these are new additional requirements, and they're going to increase the time that we take to process applications and carry out all of our annual checks. Local authorities have to implement these requirements unless there is a compelling local reason not to do so. And the timescales for the implementation are also very short. We were required to provide an update in January this year to the DFT, and they will continue to require further updates. And as a result, the costs of providing the service, particularly in relation to drivers, will unfortunately inevitably increase. I mentioned earlier that we carried out a full consultation with the trade. We notified every licence holder of the proposed new fees, and it would be fair to say that the responses were pretty much as we expected. The majority of those responding objected to the proposed fees, and that's despite the fact that the majority are actually lower than those currently paid in the legacy areas. And this was unsurprisingly particularly the case in relation to the driver fee, which is the only area where the fee has inevitably there's had to be an increase. Many of the drivers also commented on the damaging effects of COVID on the trade over the last 12 to 15 months. And there's obviously sympathy with the difficulties that the pandemic has caused, along with many other industries. But unfortunately, we have very limited options. We have to provide the service, and we have to implement the new standards. Both the standards and the case law also make it clear that financial considerations cannot be taken into account when making decisions on policy or on licence applications. So to summarise, we need to have a single set of fees and charges in place for the 6th of September in order for us to implement the new taxi policy. The policy needs to be implemented because the old legacy areas will be removed on the 6th of September. All of the old boundaries will be no longer exist. And so the existing legacy policies will no longer have any effect. This basically means that without a new policy in place, any decisions that are made on applications will be open to legal challenge, and we won't be able to take any effective enforcement action. And this would have an inevitable impact on public safety. Finally, I would just like to emphasise that any decision made on the fees this evening will be subject to annual review, and that will take into account any surplus or deficit and any savings resulting from digital improvements and from bringing the team together under one structure. We are obviously going to keep the service under constant review to ensure that any possible efficiency savings that can be made are passed on to the trade as quickly as possible, in the same way that the fees tonight are actually lower than the fees previously proposed to this committee. And we will continue to report back annually on this aspect of the licensing to committee so that they can consider any future proposal for fees. Now that's my report, Chair.
Lovely,
Happy to deal with any questions.
Thank you, Caroline. Councillor Barnes.
Thank you very much, and obviously thank you very much for your report. Firstly, I think the principle of harmonising those fees is welcome, and we need to do it because we are one council. I know others have concerns, so I'll let them speak as well. But my question was sort of answered towards the end of your report when you talked about the review of those fees. You say annually. Is there a reason why it's annual? Can it be done sooner? Can it be more agile than that? Because I think, a lot can happen in a week, let alone a year, and the taxi trade have been impacted by the pandemic and things could get much worse quite quickly. So what powers do we have now as a committee and as a council to respond much quicker on that issue of fees? Thank you.
I think largely that's, and Lindsay may correct me on this, it's a matter of accounting. So obviously the council prepares its accounts annually. We keep an eye on income and expenditure during the year, but even 12 months is actually quite a short period of time to assess the impact of the fees and whether they're set at the right level. I mean, normally you would look to assess fees over a 3-year rolling period. That would be the norm. But obviously, bearing in mind we are a new authority and it is a new structure, we're actually looking at trying to do it far more quickly than that. So I think 12 months is probably the minimum amount of time that we'd be able to carry out a review, but I'm happy for Lindsay to pick up on that one.
Yeah, so Caroline's actually absolutely right on that. So one of the other reasons that actually 12 months is about the minimum period that we could use to do that is that driver licences, particularly where the fees have gone up, so mostly vehicles and operators are actually decreasing, but the driver fees where they've gone up, you know, those licences are issued for 3 years and the cost of the fee income that comes in covers the costs of the delivery of that licence over that 3-year period. So that would be things like associated enforcement activity, you know, ongoing activity associated with that licence. So a 12-month period actually is really a snapshot of really what the service is costing over that period. So yeah, 12 months is probably means we should have a reasonable amount of robust information to be able to say, there you go, we think the structure is costing this, the service is costing this, the volume of applications into the service, which is also relevant because, you know, at the moment we're basing our assumptions on the application levels sort of when we're legacy council areas. But what we know is that, for example, we may have people holding licences in several areas. They might condense into single licences. Depending on the policy, at the moment we licence quite a lot of out of area drivers as well, Milton Keynes, Luton, those kind of areas. And you know that can change quite easily depending on the policy arrangements in those areas and where people choose to come. So I think actually, you know, within that 12-month period we should have a reasonable amount of information. Things will have settled in terms of the structure and the new policy. And we should be able then to come back and say, look, this is how it's looking, this is where it is. We can pass this back to the trade, or actually the service is costing us more to run and the fees aren't covering the cost of the service, which is the alternative. I very much hope that's not the case because the work we've done is based on all the information we have to hand and the experience of operating across the legacy areas for the last few years. So, you know, I'm pretty hopeful that wouldn't be the case. But, you know, that is an option as well. So.
Councillor Watson, then Councillor Town.
Just to understand the fees, are they payable 12 months in advance, or how is the driver actually charged?
Yeah, they're normally paid at the point of application. So they form. So when you apply for a licence, the fee is paid at that point. So if you're having a 3-year licence, you would put in your renewal application if you're already an existing driver, or if you're a completely new driver, you'd put in your application and the fee forms part of that application. So unless the fee is paid, we can't proceed with the application and we can't issue the licence. So it's taken at that point, and then we obviously use that to offset the cost of that licence over the 3-year duration. If it's a driver, a vehicle licence is 1 year. Operator can be, it's normally 5 years. Yeah, they pay up front, yeah.
Thank you. Councillor Town.
In the report, there's a mention of a deficit and a surplus from the legacy authorities. Putting those together, you still something like 86k deficit. How is that going to be dealt with over the next 12 months?
Yeah, so a decision was taken, as Caroline covered off as part of her report, not to seek to recover that deficit from the existing licensed trade. So those deficits had arisen as a result of the operation of the services within the legacy council areas, as coming together as part of a new council, new Buckinghamshire Council, setting the fees, trying to get ourselves now to a properly cost-neutral position. The decision was taken that it wouldn't be appropriate, given the pressures on the trade, to seek to recover that lost 90,000. So that's something that we could have done. So we could have incorporated that into the fee setting for this round. But yeah, corporately that decision was taken not to do that.
Thank you. Anyone else got any questions? Councillor Southworth.
Is that correct? 100% correct? Because and I'm not questioning, what you said per se. I'm just asking because at the last meeting we had on this, obviously the whole point is that all of these fees have to be sort of cost neutral. So I'm just questioning whether, in fact, if we undershot, we'd be able to then claw it back on future fees, because that would be making those future applications not cost neutral, because we'd be looking to make a profit, obviously, to set against the loss. Just because we said if there's a deficit, you said we'd be able to somehow reflect that in the fees going forward. Is that simply, I presume what you mean is we'd raise them to cover that deficit rather than we would raise them to then cover off the historic deficits that had accrued?
Yes, 100% correct. Yeah, so we're not looking to cover off the historic deficit, but if what we've done in terms of setting these fees, when we look at them, and believe me, I'll be looking at them quicker than 12 months, so we'll be watching them constantly, because this is quite a period of change for the service, so it's really important that we've got our eyes on what's going on. So if we think potentially that we've not set them at the correct level, be that we're making a surplus or we're making a deficit over that rolling 3-year period that Caroline talked about, then we will absolutely look to address that. So it might be looking to recover a deficit or looking to level off a surplus, which would mean a reduction in future fees.
Sorry, I've got a few others. First of all, I can't remember, because in the last meeting there was when were the last legacy district councils reviewed again? Because I know Chiltern was done just before we were abolished. But in terms of Aylesbury Vale and Wickham, do you have the dates for those? Just because I think it was Wickham maybe was a wee bit behind the others, but the other two were relatively recent.
Wickham was reviewed in 2019, going into 2019-2020, and it was decided, because of the decision to become a unitary, that we would freeze the fees at that stage.
Do we know about Aylesbury?
Yeah, it's within early 2018.
Okay. And I presume, just in terms of the Aylesbury setting, because Aylesbury was the only district council that I can recall which was actually turning not a profit, but it was overrunning, had a surplus. So it was about 100,000 in surplus, wasn't it? Was that, the question is more, in terms of the rate setting, the fee setting that you had for each individual line item, had you been running a loss on a particular line item, would you have been setting that loss against potential surplus from other line items? Or if, say, a 3-year Hackney carriage licence was, you were finding that the costs were, you weren't covering, you were washing your face on it, and it was £300, would you have simply just put it up the following year? What I want to know is basically, were the Aylesbury Vale figures, can we take each historic figure as being one which was profitable at that time, or were some of them offsetting others? I know the question is not phrased very well, but
no, I think we understand, actually, because there's some quite significant restrictions placed on us about the funding streams. So not only are we not allowed to use taxi licensing income to cover off anything else, but if the income relates to vehicles, then that can only be used in relation to vehicles. So there was some series of case law judgments, which I think I'd have to look to these guys to confirm, but basically means that if the driver income has to be used to provide the driver service, the vehicle income has to be used to provide the vehicle service, the operator income has to be used to provide the operator service. So when we calculate the fees, we take those areas separately and we look at them independently, and then we arrive at the fees based on the different types of activity in those areas and different processes. So the other thing, just around the Aylesbury side, so the staffing arrangements in Aylesbury are slightly different. So how that means is that currently at the moment, before we move into our new structure, which will be from the 1st of September, and then we'll be a single service, but what happens is that we have a series of what we call establishment posts that sit within the a budgeted establishment structure for Aylesbury, and then we have a series of funded posts, and those posts are funded by income. So where you have an increase in demand, you have to meet that demand. the staffing levels are increased to meet that demand, and the income that comes in offsets it. So what we do at the end of each financial period is offset the staffing overspend against any surplus that's sitting in the account, and that's been the model historically. So going forward, it'll look that a much more level kind of playing field, because we'll actually have a full establishment staffing structure based on demand. That's the demand level that we should have. So does that make sense?
I think so. So first point though, then each line item covered itself
Yes.
at Aylesbury. Okay. Secondly, so that's clear. Okay. And secondly, so from what you just, the last thing that you said, are you simply saying that basically when you got to the end of each financial year, if you say had £100,000 surplus, it showed that obviously the team had been working exceptionally hard and you therefore needed more staffing, and that was rolled into the next year?
No,
or?
I'm not saying that.
Sorry, I completely misunderstood then.
So
Apologies.
I think what I'm saying is that, so Aylesbury Vale, after the Deregulation Act, we saw a very large influx of applications into the area, partly, I think I would have said to you before, to do with digital access, I think, and a number of other factors. And as a result of that, you have to increase your establishment to meet demand, because otherwise you can't meet your service standards. So you can't provide the licence within the time period that the trade expect. That creates additional demand, because obviously they need the licences to trade, and so they're calling and emailing. So in order to manage that increase in demand, we had to create additional posts. And the funding that the additional volume of work was bringing in was used to pay for those posts. At the end of the year, when we knew what that looked like. Is that clearer? Yeah.
But just in terms of the responses to this, obviously the main one that I'm concerned about is what the Taxi Drivers Association actually said, which is not part of this report. I would be grateful if you could sort of summarise as best and accurately as you can what their actual representations were and what they wanted to see happen. I mean, it may well be they took the approach of no change at all and all of that, and I appreciate that might have been what their members wanted them to say, but was there any actual, did they come back with any numbers that they wanted us to consider? Because that would be helpful to know.
No, I mean, I think it might be worth mentioning. So we did informally spend some time with the LPHCA, Licensed Private Hire Car Association. And the thing that Caroline didn't cover off in her report is that since we last presented to the licensing committee, the Department for Transport have very handily given us an idea of what the increase should be each year for a driver licence to cover off the statutory standards. And it's £62.67, is that correct? Yeah, £62.67 a year. So over a 3-year licence, 187-ish pounds. And that is the increase that they would expect to be applied to a driver licence to cover off the statutory standards. So if you look actually at the legacy fees that were charged in the district council areas, and then you take that DFT amount of £187 odd, what you'll find actually is that we're either in that kind of ballpark, or actually, we're not charging as much over the 3-year period as the DFT say is a reasonable amount to charge the drivers. So I just wanted to point that out, because I do think that that's actually really helpful for the committee and for the service in terms of understanding whether or not we're adopting a reasonable approach. And I'm not sure I've now answered your question. The private hire. Yeah, so the reason that I was thinking about that actually when I was thinking about them is that we've been having some informal conversations with them around a variety of issues with the policy, and obviously they're engaged with a lot of local authorities at the moment who are looking to review fees and set fees. We sent the proposed fees out to them. I don't think we had a formal response back in relation to the fees. We did meet with them. I think the feedback generally was that they understood that the fees had to go up. I think they feel that the introduction of the statutory standards during a pandemic is, perhaps a really difficult time for government to have done that, but, we are where we are. I think that they understood that we'd needed to take the approach that we'd taken, and that they could see that we were within the ballpark or lower than the DFT level that had been set. So there was no formal response back, but conversations were positive.
That's interesting. I just assumed that basically because there's 3,500 taxi drivers and there were seemingly there was not a huge response to the consultation. I presumed that they'd come under an umbrella, as it were, and the Taxi Driver Association had made pretty comprehensive representations. But
they don't really, actually. So I think they're only representative of about 40 of our operators, and we've got in the region of 300 operators. So, I think although they've got a reasonable representation in our area, they definitely are not, all drivers are definitely not under a blanket organisation in terms of feeding in.
Does anyone else have any more questions, or we'll let Councillor Southworth ask his next one?
interrogation. If you could just refresh my memory, because again, the detail escapes me, but under 10 vehicles, 1 year to 5 year, and under 50 vehicles, 1 year to 50 year. Obviously, that's the most significant additional line item on here. You able to just explain what those mean again? Because you did explain it at a previous meeting, but I can't remember.
So effectively, it's the way that private hire operators are set up. So it depends upon how many vehicles they're operating. So you'll have one-man bands that will literally just operate their own vehicle from home, their home address often, and obviously they need to be charged a lot less than the companies that are operating sort of 50 to 100 vehicles. And then with the operator licences, they are usually issued on a 5-year licence, effectively. There may be some exceptions to that, but it would normally be for a 5-year period. Was that your question?
Yes, I think so. So just to be clear, say you have a gentleman or whoever is running a company and they have 10 vehicles, they're going to pay, for 5 years, they're going to pay 559, and that's it.
Yes.
It's not going to be 559 per vehicle.
No, so that's for the operator licence, and then each individual vehicle licence will be charged. There's obviously a charge for processing a vehicle application separately. So the operator licence, because obviously we need to, during the course of the operator licence, we need to carry out annual checks. That will include the cost of enforcement and all of those things. So they are separate, but it would not be fair to charge somebody that's operating one vehicle the same as somebody that's operating 50 vehicles.
I see. So that's why, these are obviously entirely new additions to the charging system that we have.
So it's in Wickham, that's how it was previously charged. It was banded because we carry out annual checks on all of the operators. And I think in Chiltern, it was the same. Chiltern and South Bucks, it was banded. So I think Aylesbury was slightly different. And across the country, authorities charge operator fees differently. You can have more than one method of doing it.
Has anyone else got any more questions? No? Okay. So we have one recommendation in the report before us. Before I ask for proposal and seconder, I'll read it. That the proposed fees and charges set out at Appendix 1 to the report are agreed and to become effective as of the 6th of September 2021. I'm looking for a proposer.
We have an opportunity now, having grilled the officers, to actually debate whether actually we want to agree the motion. I say that because at the last meeting in March, or in fact it was probably April, because we held it at relatively short notice, we were told that actually if members took the view that they didn't agree with the recommendations that had come out of the consultation, we were at liberty to change those if we thought that there was good reason for doing so or something else. I mean, I don't know if that's correct. I mean, before we move straight to voting on this, it would seem surely we need to have at least a consensus around the room just to check there's nothing, that we're actually happy, all things considered, to do that. No? I simply say that because it's just, this is a fairly significant, for lots of people's livelihoods, this is a fairly significant change. I know some will be benefiting, but then equally we have to be mindful of the fact that there are many taxi drivers who, and I appreciate this is not the overriding consideration with these reviews, they've had a pretty rough year where they've had very little income, and some are going to see potentially appreciable increases in what they're paying for licence fees. So I wonder if perhaps we could, for the first year, and I'm just speculating, I'm just sort of talking off off my head here, but maybe we try to taper into this, because if there is indeed going to be a one-year review, and I hear that, and I'm sure in all good faith there will hopefully be a one-year review, but from my experience on Chiltern, which was admittedly brief, that hadn't been reviewed for 6 or 7 years. So my concern is that if we set these figures now and they turn out to be clearly wrong, it's going to actually take a lot longer to put together the work, etc., to unpick this than if we get it wrong now tonight and we set it slightly too low. There's a lot more of a impetus on us as a council to actually review it in 12 years and make sure we pin it to the right number. But if we set it too high, there is obviously a potential comfort blanket for the council to let it rest as that, because we're not doing so badly out of that if we peg it wrong. So I was thinking for the first year potentially we take, I don't know, we could do something like take the lowest historic figure, because if these were revised in 2018-19 and some of them were doing well, if we get it wrong, then it's a weight on the council to deliver the savings that we've promised in forming a unitary. I mean, the whole point was we can improve our services, we can improve what we're delivering to residents, and it's if we set ambitious targets, I'd rather do that, and then yes, we may miss them, but then at least we can't be faulted for having not tried to set a benchmark that delivers for our residents. And the taxi drivers are all residents of our county, and they, as I said, this isn't the overriding consideration, but they've had a pretty rough year, and they've helped a lot of people who've been isolated, and who've needed their services perhaps more than ever, and they've had to accommodate a lot of COVID prevention, prevention against COVID, all of that sort of, the apparatus they've had to have in their taxis. I just thought I'd throw that out there before we start. We sort of.
Great. Thank you for your comments. I hear what you're saying. Lindsay, do you have anything to respond?
So I would just obviously say members are completely within their rights to amend the proposed fees that are in front of them this evening. I just would point out to you that we have very carefully costed the service as far as we're able to do so. If you choose to reduce the fees that are proposed tonight, what that will mean is that we cannot cover the costs of the service, and the service will not be cost neutral next year. In terms of providing service, the trade are really clear that they want their licences in a timely fashion. So they want us to provide a high quality service, and we pride ourselves in the main in doing that. We're investing considerably at the moment in improving our digital technology so that we can try to automate as many of our processes as possible to try and reduce costs going forward. And I'm hopeful that we will be able to pass further efficiencies back to the trade. I think that setting the fees based on the lowest legacy fee personally would be a mistake. That would not cover the costs of delivering the additional requirements that are being placed on us by the government. So I just to be very clear would point out that in the main, vehicle licence fees are coming down. In the main, operator licence fees are coming down for the trade. The only significant increase that you're seeing is for driver licence fees, and that is as a result of implementing these statutory standards, which obviously have been brought in by government to protect the public. There's an awful lot of work associated with that for us, and that is where you're seeing the increase and why you're seeing the increase. And obviously it's for members to make decisions about what they choose to do in relation to the fees that we've proposed.
Thank you. Councillor Baum had a question, and then Councillor Watson.
Thanks. Just by way of contributing to this debate that Councillor Southworth has initiated, which I think is important, he used the phrase, if we get this wrong, and for me, that's the most important thing. Obviously, I'm concerned about the level of fees, but, I trust you that you've set it at the right amount, and obviously we don't want the council to be making a loss. My only concern, and the reason why I asked my original question about review, is because I think that's important. I appreciate, you've got a year, but perhaps as a compromise or a consensus, we can, and I'm a new member, so I don't know how this is done, but I would like to see as soon as possible how that is going and how the taxi drivers are finding it and how that level of fee is actually working out in practice, and whether or not we can have a discussion before next September and actually look at that as a committee. I don't know if that's a reasonable request, but I think it is important so that we're on top of this going into the future and not waiting 12 months before we do something.
So I think it might be possible for us to provide an update, but I think that update would need to come with a caveat that we might not be in a position to provide you with enough evidence to make a change of decision at that point. So I think we could probably do an update paper to committee, or we could do, obviously if the committee doesn't, we can do that as a briefing session as well with members. So I think there's an opportunity there to keep members in the loop in terms of sort of what's going on with the budgets and
I think
sort of
that
where
would be
we
a very
are.
good idea.
Yeah.
Yep. Then Councillor Watson.
I think a good discipline in any council is to be business-like, even if we're not really a business as such. And a business setting its prices, which is what we're talking about here, would presumably calculations have been done to talk about the number of licences you expect and the mix of licences and then determining and also your cost structure. It's an interesting point from my colleague. The general public expect lower costs per unit from a unitary council. That remains to be seen, but that is the expectation. So I presume there's some model, some financial analysis that's been done, and being an accountant by experience, I'd certainly like to see something like that. So maybe that's more appropriate for a briefing session rather than one of these meetings. So I'd like to see that. But I don't see currently, unless I'm missing something, and I may be missing it, is a price comparison, what they're paying now and what they're going to pay from September. I mean, I just can't see that in the analysis.
Yeah, there is a comparison in the appendices.
Can you
between
help me see which one it is?
If I can wait for my computer up, yes.
There are comparisons with other areas, but not.
179 and 180, around about that. I've only got one printout with one page number, but 179.
So I think it's Appendix B.
177.
Appendix B.
So I think, is that Appendix B? Yeah.
Okay, I've only got this thing online. So Appendix B, the second page.
Yep.
So where's before and after?
So it's got the proposed Buckinghamshire Council fee
Right.
against the current Aylesbury Vale fees, Chiltern and South Bucks,
So
Wickham.
that's about 6%, doing that in my head.
You can see the percentage increase or decrease is set out in each column for each area, with green being a percentage decrease and red being a percentage increase. So you can see the greens for the vehicles, where most of the fees are lower. You can see the greens for the operators, with a couple of exceptions, where most of the fees are lower. And then if you scroll to the next page, that's where you'll see your driver fees, which is where you're seeing increases predominantly, other than in the Chiltern South Bucks areas in some licence cases.
I'm sorry I've missed that before.
Do you wish time to absorb that? And we'll go on to someone else who's got another question.
So the Wickham lot get 62% increases. Golly.
Does anyone else have anything they wish to say, ask?
I'd like to I think my colleague is right. We ought to.
Councillor Wood?
Well, I have to say that as a fairly new councillor to the unitary, I have every faith in the group who are setting the fees. So for me, I've got to go with what you're suggesting and proposing, because times are tough for everyone, not just taxi drivers. My business is suffering as well, but I've got to go with the flow. And for me, I've got to trust in you, so I'll be backing you.
Okay. Councillor Southworth?
Yeah, so my thoughts were, if obviously my colleagues are terms of, okay, the most significant points I can see is under operator license. They've introduced, as you said, as flagged earlier, they've introduced a new line item for those under 10.
Sorry. You've introduced the new charges for under 10, under 50 vehicles. Now, that in itself will be absorbed by those operators who are running several taxis and I presume have taxis working for them. So they will be effectively somewhat, and it will be distributed to their taxi drivers, but it will be absorbed somewhat by a larger group. So in terms of the driver's licenses though, that's on an individual basis, isn't it? So that's actually being paid by an individual tax. Every single taxi driver has to have that charge. So if we can't do anything, if people aren't minded to put these figures out with a sort of a taking, and do each one line by line, might there be something we can at least do so that individual drivers aren't also facing this sort of these rises as punitive as potentially for some cases as are proposed at the driver's license point, and at least the sum which are being charged for the operators' licenses to the larger groups, those will be hopefully absorbed by as I said, the larger associations. So for example, I mean, look, everything's been pegged to 303 there, which say, if you're from Aylesbury, that's up from 175 on one line. If you're from Wickham, it's a wholesale increase across the board. And as I said, there's a ratchet effect on a lot of the things that we decide where they only ever go up. Would it be better to at least be wrong in part on some of it, and that will at least be offset potentially if on balance the fees, it comes out in the wash of the fees? I don't know.
Can I just say in favour of what's being proposed, if we start to make a loss, then that's got to be absorbed somewhere else. So someone's got to start paying for that loss.
Yes,
so I would say...
So I would just point out that's council tax and business rates. Yep. So what you're asking the public to do is to subsidise the taxi licensing service.
Yep.
Yeah.
I was about to say that, thank you. No, that's quite all right. It's a very good point.
I do fully appreciate that, and I absolutely take the point. And we don't want to be unfairly subsidising people for unfairly subsidising, but at the same time, as I said, the problem is if we end up overcharging, it's a lot harder. And as you said earlier, in a year's time, you'd only be able to give us a sort of an overview of how the policy was going. I don't think it was a chance to review.
What I said is that within a 12-month period, we should be in a reasonable position to give you a proper view on surplus and deficit. So I think that that's a good point for us to do that. So that's what I said with that regard. The only thing I would just point out finally is that, the cost to a driver per year of having a licence to drive a vehicle and go out and earn a living is £101. If you think about, I know they have other overheads as well, but if you think about the impacts of the pandemic across a raft of businesses, that does seem to me to be a reasonable cost of a licence to go out and earn a living over that period of time. We wouldn't have sought to put the fees up for them, and you can see that from the vehicles and from the operators, but we cannot deliver what the government want us to deliver for them in terms of protecting the public unless we put the fees up to cover the cost of the additional checks.
Councillor Baum.
I appreciate this may have already been said, but just for clarity, in 12 months' time, you'll be in a reasonable position to look at this. But, and again, you may have already said this, but when will we be in a position to raise the fees, lower the fees, wherever we are in a year, because we don't know, and you're doing your best, assessments. We don't know, but when can we change those so that if Councillor Southworth is right and it's too high, when can we lower that?
You can change them at any point. So, if the information that we provide to you indicates that there's a problem there, then in terms of surplus or deficit, then obviously I would be looking to change them as well. So, yeah, we would just bring that forward to you and change it. It would have to come forward in the same way, so we would propose, it would go out to consultation, so there's a process around that.
And can you just explain the mechanism for that, so that the public consultation, the pre-engagement, the meeting,
yeah.
the full how long? So
how long
in a year's time, if it's too high,
and it needs to come down,
How long does it take?
how long does this council take to reduce that?
So I'll let Caroline help me with this because it's set in law, isn't it? So there's a process we have to follow legally.
Yes, so changes to fees normally have to be advertised. I think if the fees are all going down, correct me if I'm wrong, we don't have to advertise that, do we? I think it's only if there's an increase in fees. Yes, but we would have already advertised that. We can double check that, but I think if all of the fees are going down, there's no need for the statutory advertising. If we do need to advertise, it's a 28-day period. So we would need to bring a report to committee with all of the information that we had. If necessary, take them out for advertising for 28 days, then bring the consultation responses back to committee for consideration. And then obviously as soon as committee have made a decision, we can implement them immediately after that.
So probably 3 months.
Councillor Baum?
Perfect, thank you.
And then we'll Councillor Watson. Councillor Baum, then Councillor Watson.
Is it okay if I just jump in with one more point, which Councillor Southworth and I have discussed, and I'm not sure if we covered it, which was not about the fees, but about some of the complaints that we've had in our own consultation with some of the taxi drivers, has been about this change and taxi drivers having to go up to Aylesbury for their MOT centre. Can you just clarify for me, as I don't drive a taxi, what the rationale behind that was? Because that's obviously, again, not just the fees, that's been a concern that came through in the consultation, sure, but is continuing to come through, because you've got consultation, then you've got taxi drivers coming to councillors but not going through the usual channels. So that's some of the feedback that we've been getting recently.
So obviously the first thing I'd say is that if you're getting feedback from the trade, it's really useful for us to know about it. So yeah, please let us know, because that way we can it informs our judgments as well, but it also means that we can come back to you and in some occasions set the record straight, and this is one of those. So in the fee table there is a fee included for the Pembroke Road Testing Centre. That is because the council operates the Pembroke Road Testing Centre. Therefore we are required to ask you around those fees. So when we set the proposed fees out, we have to tell you there's a fee there for the test because it's delivered within a council testing centre. All of our other testing centres where the vehicles go across the legacy council areas are privately operated. So because of that, we don't set their fees, they set their fees, and therefore they're not included in the fee table that comes to you. So I would imagine what probably has happened, and I think we have had some feedback. Charlie, you spoke to a couple of the trade, didn't you? So I imagine what's happened is they've looked at the fee table, seen a testing fee solely for Pembroke Road, and made an assumption that we're going to require all the vehicles to go through the Pembroke Road Testing Centre because that fee is in the proposed fee table. That isn't the case. So there's no proposal currently to require the vehicles to go to a particular testing centre other than the testing centres that they currently use, which are authorised testing centres. Obviously, going forward, it's important that we do look to think about aligning our testing regime and ensuring that we've got a consistent approach across the council area. But that's not a piece of work that's ongoing at the moment. So that will come back round probably via the committee. I would suggest probably second quarter next year, because it's sort of a piece of work that we need to do going forward. But at the moment, that's not a proposal. So that's an assumption that the trade have made that isn't the case.
Can I just ask that you possibly send that to me in writing, that response? Is that okay?
We did actually have a meeting with quite a few representatives of the trade that I called, and that was something they brought up, and we made it quite clear to them that there is no change to where they currently go to have their vehicle tested. If they went to Aylesbury, they go to Aylesbury. If they went to somewhere in Wickham, they go to somewhere in Wickham, and Cheshire and Cheshire. There's no change.
But I can definitely put it in writing for you.
Okay. Councillor Watson.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm looking at this price comparison table, and now I realise that the colours of the numbers aren't always correct, I'm afraid. I'll give you the example of Aylesbury, 3-year Hackney carriage driver's licence.
Sorry, which one are you looking at, Councillor Watson?
Appendix B, page 2.
Mm-hmm.
If you look online, it's got it should be the number should be in red, but it's shown in green. It's only now looking at it the second time. Because the current fee is 193, you're proposing it goes up to 303, so that's a 57% increase. And it's shown in green, and it should be in red.
I agree with you. The text is green, but the box is red.
Yes,
So the box
that's
shows a red. So that's probably
and I was confused by that.
probably just. I'm sorry to confuse you. I think that's probably just a typo on my part. But the box itself is red, which indicates an increase. And we've been really clear with you right the way through the meeting that driver fees are increasing.
It's really about harmonisation, isn't it? It's a speed. We've had councils making different decisions, coming up with quite different numbers. And whether you have a big bang or whether you have a transition, I suppose those are the two options. We have to harmonise, I understand. We can't carry on with separate fee structures.
No, we need to have one policy, one fee structure to cover. There will be some winners and losers, unfortunately, with this. But as Councillor Woods pointed out, question about if the charges were lower and there was a deficit, that would have to come from somewhere else, not come from the council tax. So the general public would have to pay and subsidise for the taxi trade.
Yeah, that's right.
But, as Councillor Baum has drilled right down, we can review this, we can change this. So it won't go away. We can keep an eye on it closely, which the officers have agreed that they will keep an eye on this closely, because there's nowhere we want to make a profit out of the trade, but we also don't want to have to draw money in to subsidise the trade to the down of the general public.
I mean, I would just point out that the previous meetings where we committed to the 12-month review, that was minuted within the committee minutes. That commitment's there. It's 100% on my list of things that are coming to committee in my programme that I'm bringing forward. It can be recorded tonight as well, so I can give you every confidence that we will bring that item forward for you.
Does anyone else have any more questions or wish to have further discussion points? Is the committee happy to go to vote? Yes? Yes, okay. Okay, so I'll repeat again. There's one recommendation in the report before us. Is there, we'll work out the proposal and seconder shortly. That recommendation is that the proposed fees and charges set out in Appendix 1 to the report are agreed to become effective as of the 6th of September 2021. Do I have a proposer? Councillor Wood. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Derek Town. So we shall now vote and we'll go by show of hands. So I'd like to ask for the people who are for the motion.
Six, Chairman.
Thank you. And abstentions? And against?
One, Chairman.
Thank you. The motion's carried. Thank you. That concludes the details for the evening, although I just have to say that we do need an extra meeting in October. The date was, Claire?
It's Wednesday the 20th of October.
So if you could please take note of that. Details will come out shortly. So the next meeting before the October one is the 7th of September at 6:30. And we'll see you there. So thank you very much.
Excuse me, Chair, can I ask, is there any chance of us, I think the last time we asked about moving the meetings to another place, it was because of the lockdown. I think, was there any movement in changing the location for the meetings?
Unfortunately, no.
Still no?
Still no.
Thank you.
So that concludes tonight's meeting. Thank you very much for attending. 7th of September. Has the recording stopped?